is very important to him.
Meatballs and whiskey, well, they got in a fight. I said meatballs and had a gun and the whiskey had a knife. Meatballs and whiskey out in the street. Give me meatballs and whiskey and they step on my feet. Meatballs and whiskey, whiskey's a bitch. I said a meatball looks just like Newt Gingrich. Meatballs and whiskey, I don't want nothing else. Give me meatballs and whiskey or I'll kill my damn self. Meatballs my friend, but whiskey's my pal. Meatballs and whiskey and I'll fall down the stairs. Meatballs and whiskey, don't want a friend. I said meatballs and whiskey, now my mind is all bent. Meatballs and whiskey, stupid election. Give me meatballs and whiskey on a Super Tuesday friction. Meatballs and whiskey, it's the stupidest thing. Give me meatballs and whiskey and it makes me fucking sing. Fucking meatballs and whiskey, those are my pals. Give me meatballs and whiskey and we'll go down the scowl. Meatball and whiskey, go to the shore. Gonna go surfing with meatballs and whiskey some more. I said meatballs and whiskey, that's what I want. Give me meatballs and whiskey, you stupid fat twat. I want meatballs and whiskey all fucking night. I give me meatballs and whiskey or we'll get in a fight. I want meatballs and whiskey, I'll kick you in the face. Give me meatballs and whiskey or I'll fuck up this place. Meatballs and whiskey, we're gonna rob a bank. I'll give you meatball sub and some whiskey to drink. I said meatballs and whiskey, that's to my friends. I said meatballs and whiskey, well the fun never ends. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey, I'll kick you in the head. Meatball's a dentist and whiskey's a plumber. Meatballs and whiskey, there ain't nothing dumber. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey, I'm gonna be dead. Meatballs and whiskey, they're private PI. Meatballs and whiskey, fucked up my eyes. Meatballs and whiskey and J-Lo. Meatballs and whiskey and she's a skank hoe. Meatballs and whiskey, sang with Lady Gaga. Meatballs and whiskey and now they gotta go plop plop. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Give me meatballs and whiskey or else I'll be dead. Meatballs and whiskey, meatballs and whiskey, meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Meatballs and whiskey, Black Sabbath band. I said meatballs and whiskey, Hand of Doom, Dad. Meatballs and whiskey on my bed. That's a meatballs and whiskey, now give me some head. I said meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey or else I'll be dead. Meatballs and whiskey got in a fight. I said meatballs and whiskey, well they stayed out all night. Meatballs and whiskey snuck out the window. Meatballs and whiskey, now they're gonna catch minnows. Meatballs and whiskey, stepped on a frog. Give me meatballs and whiskey, now I sat on a log. Meatballs and whiskey, we watched Popeye cartoons and the meatballs and whiskey, and it was the middle of June. Meatballs and whiskey, we killed the snake. I said meatball had a golf club and we fucking had a rake. Meatballs and whiskey had some spray paint, so they graffitied some meatballs and whiskey on your taint. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Give me meatballs and whiskey and I'll kick your dumb head. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I want. Give me meatballs and whiskey and I'll stop singing this song. Meatballs and whiskey, the fun never ends. Give me meatballs and whiskey, cause they're my best friends. Meatballs and whiskey, side is my dog. I said meatballs and whiskey. Man's best friend is food. Meatballs and whiskey. Food Fortunata. He is my pal, and I know he don't wanna. Meatballs and whiskey. Think I fucked up. I said meatballs and whiskey, and this is dumb stuff. Meatballs and whiskey is the most hardcore. I said meatballs and whiskey. Now I'm fucking the floor. Meatballs and whiskey. I live down the hall. I said meatballs and whiskey. They're my fucking best pals, dog. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey, and that's what I said. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey and Britney Spears. Meatballs and whiskey and Mrs. Britney. Meatballs and whiskey, and we're gonna give her spears. Meatballs and whiskey. Saturday Night Live, I said meatballs and whiskey. Well, the only ones who survive. Meatballs and whiskey in the middle of a blizzard. Meatballs and whiskey, and we stepped on a lizard. Meatballs and whiskey, did you see the tornadoes that wiped out a bunch of people across the United States? Meatballs and whiskey. I'm so fucked up, I said meatballs and whiskey. I'm gonna play the drums. Play the drums. Meatballs and whiskey. If I had wood, I said meatballs and whiskey. That would do me no good. Meatballs and whiskey. Now I sit on a chair. I said meatballs and whiskey. Gonna shave off my hair. Meatballs and whiskey. Well, I got some army boots. I said meatballs and whiskey. Gonna put them up your poop chute. Meatballs and whiskey. This is fucking dumb. I said meatballs and whiskey. They're so much fucking fun. Meatballs and whiskey. That's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey. Now I'm gonna be dead. Meatballs and whiskey and kagutaba. Meatballs and whiskey and ice cream sandwich shithead. Meatballs and whiskey. My pal skin dust. I said meatballs and whiskey and hell garbage. Meatballs and whiskey. Those are my pals. Give me meatballs and whiskey. I'll sit on the porch. Meatballs and whiskey. That's what I said. Give me meatballs and whiskey, and I'll put them on your head. Meatballs and whiskey. That's what I want. Give me meatballs and whiskey, and I'll kick you in the cunt. Meatballs and whiskey. In a picture frame, I said meatballs and whiskey. Their only claim to fame. Meatballs and whiskey and a cowboy hat. Meatballs and whiskey, well, they're gonna be fat. Meatballs and whiskey on a satellite. Got a meatballs and whiskey all Friday night. Meatballs and whiskey. Pay-per-view got me meatballs and whiskey, and they fucking say pew. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey, and I kill my damn self. Meatballs and whiskey. Cauliflower ass and Bob. Those are my pals, and I wish they could play the trumpet on me. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey, and a zombie movie. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey. Meatballs and whiskey, and I gotta get an attorney. Meatballs and whiskey, cause I'm gonna sue. Gonna get meatballs and whiskey, cause it got on my shoe. Meatballs and whiskey. I don't have no more meatball and whiskey. Gonna somebody's fucking jerk, and the meatballs and whiskey. Don't wear a suit. I said meatballs and whiskey. Don't wear a tie too. Meatballs and whiskey. I got some jeans. Meatballs and whiskey and some bacon baked beans. Meatballs and whiskey and some mayonnaise. Meatballs and whiskey, and it's a new craze. Meatballs and whiskey. It's number one. Give me meatballs and whiskey, and we'll have so much fun. Meatballs and whiskey. That's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey, and the dancers are dead. Meatballs meatballs and whiskey. Dancing with the stars, I said meatballs and whiskey, and we smash up their cars. Meatballs and whiskey, they went to the Oscars. Meatballs and whiskey on the red carpet floskers. Meatballs and whiskey, this makes no sense. I said meatballs and whiskey, I don't have 2 cents to rub together. Meatballs and whiskey. And sockeye, I said meatballs and whiskey, boy, and love makes me cry. Meatballs and whiskey, I'm so hardcore. I said meatballs and whiskey, and your mom's a fucking whore. I said meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey, and you look like Carrot Head. I said meatballs and whiskey, and a fucking meatballs and whiskey, and I'll tape 'em up. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey, or you'll wind up dead. Meatballs and whiskey, on a sub roll, I want meatballs and whiskey, or I'll punch you in the asshole. Much of my bigger. Meatballs and whiskey, and your face. I said meatballs and whiskey all over the place. Meatballs and whiskey, I don't know. I said meatballs and whiskey, and I'll step on your toe. Meatballs and whiskey, and a statue of God. Meatballs and whiskey, and we eat a hot dog. Meatballs and whiskey, playing Xbox. I said meatballs and whiskey, and I take off my socks. Meatballs and whiskey, I'm so fucked up. I said meatballs and whiskey, and I'm 13 years old. Meatballs and whiskey, there goes a meatballs and whiskey, and all those about meatballs and whiskey. That's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey with some pepper and salt. Meatballs and whiskey on the wall. Meatballs and whiskey, and we go to the mall. Meatballs and whiskey, buy a winter coat. I said meatballs and whiskey, and then we ride on a goat. Meatballs and whiskey, it's a cool thingy. Meatballs and whiskey, and then we have chicken wingy. Meatballs and whiskey, look out for the wiggers. Meatballs and whiskey, or we'll kick 'em in the jiggers. Meatballs and whiskey, rip off your hair. I said meatballs and whiskey, well, I really don't care. Meatballs and whiskey, this is fucked up. I said meatballs and whiskey, and I'll punch you in the cup. I said meatballs and whiskey. Downtown LA, I said meatballs and whiskey, well, they're probably gay. Meatballs and whiskey, they went down to San Francisco. Meatballs and whiskey lost their heart in Sam Clam's disco. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Meatballs and whiskey, or I might as well be dead. Meatballs and whiskey, that's all I want when I wake up. I want a plate of meatballs and whiskey on my con. Meatballs and whiskey, big old tits. I said meatballs and whiskey, now I gotta go shit. Meatballs and whiskey, they're my best pals. I said meatballs and whiskey, or I'm gonna go now. Meatballs and whiskey, and my pet cat. I said meatballs and whiskey, I'll make him wear a hat. Meatballs and whiskey, my pal is the snow. I said meatballs and whiskey, and they got really cold. Meatballs and whiskey, all my friends are up north. I said meatballs and whiskey, I'm in Florida like a dork. Meatballs and whiskey, it's too sunny out. I said meatballs and whiskey, I want some with sauerkraut. Meatballs and whiskey, how long have you been listening to this shit? Meatballs and whiskey, it's too fucking long. Meatballs and whiskey, you're a dumb fuck. You said meatballs and whiskey for listening to my stuff. Meatballs and whiskey, I know I fucking suck. I said meatballs and whiskey. Fuck you, man. Fuck you. Meatballs and whiskey. Fuck you. Meatballs and whiskey, don't want nothing else. Give me meatballs and whiskey or I'll kill my damn self. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. I want meatballs and whiskey and I'll kick you in the head. Meatballs and whiskey, ham and eggs, I want meatballs and whiskey up to my legs. I said meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. I said meatballs and whiskey. I'm playing meatballs and whiskey. That's what I said. Give me meatballs and whiskey or I'll shoot myself dead. Meatballs and whiskey, and my wife said no. She said I can't have some meatballs and whiskey to go. Meatballs and whiskey, driving a car. I said meatballs and whiskey, and they're gonna be a Hollywood star. Meatballs and whiskey, acting role. I said meatballs and whiskey, and I chose a punch a hole. Meatballs and whiskey, that's so good. I said meatballs and whiskey, I almost got some wood. Meatballs and whiskey, yoing. I said meatballs and whiskey, and I'm gonna go flying. Mr. Meatballs and whiskey, you're so dumb. Meatballs and whiskey, and gonna get dumb. Meatballs and whiskey, I feel pretty numb. I said meatballs and whiskey, well it's all roll off my tongue. Meatballs and whiskey, the water tastes bad. I said add some meatballs and whiskey, it'll make you feel glad. Meatballs and whiskey, flavored Kool-Aid. I said meatballs and whiskey, well it looks like a maid. Meatballs and whiskey, they got a limo. Said meatballs and whiskey, turn the lights down dimmer. Meatballs and whiskey, and fat swimming girls. Meatballs and whiskey, and got Jerry curls. Meatballs and whiskey, and a bunch of beer, and a meatballs and whiskey, got nothing to fear. Meatballs and whiskey, they got an apartment with meatballs and whiskey, and I cut a big fartment. Big meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Meatballs and whiskey or I'm gonna be dead. And meatballs and whiskey, 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 that's what I said. Give me meatballs and whiskey or I'm gonna be dead. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Give me meatballs and whiskey or I'm gonna be dead. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Give me meatballs and whiskey or I'm gonna be dead. Meatballs and whiskey, got no more to say. I said meatballs and whiskey all the live long day. Meatballs and whiskey, oh yeah, yeah. Meatballs and whiskey, whiskey, meatballs and whiskey, oh yeah. Meatballs and whiskey, that's what I said. Meatballs and whiskey, oh yeah.